October 26, 1942. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The South Pacific is a flat, blinding mirror of azure, broken only by the gray steel of the USS Enterprise and the foaming wakes of her destroyers. But nobody is looking at the water. Every neck is craned upward. Every eye is burning from the salt spray and the tropical sun. High above, the sky is infested. Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers are screaming down from 10,000 feet. They look like angry hornets. They sound like industrial machinery tearing itself apart. On the deck of the battleship escort, gunner's mate First Class Red O'Malley is fighting a losing battle. He is strapped into the harness of a 5-inch 38 caliber gun mount. He is 22 years old from Des Moines, Iowa, and he is sweating through his dungarees. Load, set, fire. The rhythm is frantic. The loader shoves a 55-pound shell into the breech. The heavy steel block slams shut. O'Malley stomps the pedal. Boom! The gun recoils violently, sliding back in its housing like a piston. The smell of burnt cordite, sharp, sulfurous, choking, floods the mount. It's the smell of the Navy at war. O'Malley watches the tracer arc into the blue. He waits. He prays. A black puff of smoke appears in the sky. It is a terrifyingly beautiful sight. A dark, jagged blossom of shrapnel. But it is useless. The black puff appears 500 yards behind the Japanese bomber. The enemy pilot doesn't even flinch. He just adjusts his stick, banks left, and continues his dive toward the American carrier. Adjust fuse, up 2 seconds. The fire controlman screams into the headset. But it's too late. The plane is gone. This scene wasn't just bad luck. It was a mathematical catastrophe that was playing out across every ocean in 1942. Let's pause the action on that deck for a moment and look at the cold, hard physics of why Red O'Malley, a trained expert, couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. The problem wasn't the gun. The 5-inch 38 was a marvel of American engineering. It could hurl a shell 7 miles high. The problem wasn't the men. They were brave, drilled, and desperate. The problem was the fuse. In 1942, anti-aircraft shells used mechanical time fuses. Think of a kitchen timer, but one that has to survive being shot out of a cannon. Before the shell is loaded, a nose setter twists a ring on the tip of the shell. If the enemy plane is 4,000 yards away, the computer calculates the flight time and sets the fuse for, let's say, 12.4 seconds. The shell fires. Inside the nose cone, a clockwork mechanism begins to tick, 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 tick. At exactly 12.4 seconds, the spring releases, the primer strikes, and the shell explodes. It sounds precise. It was anything but. Here is the math that was killing American sailors. An aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour travels 440 feet every single second. A 5-inch shell travels at 2,600 feet per second. If the fuse is set for 12.4 seconds, but the plane is actually at the point the shell reaches at 12.3 seconds, the shell flies harmlessly past the tail. If the fuse is set for 12.5 seconds, the shell explodes after the plane has already passed. The margin of error was negligible. It was a fraction of a heartbeat. To score a kill with a mechanical time fuse, the gunner had to solve a 3-dimensional trigonometry equation in his head, estimate the speed of a diving target, set a mechanical clock, and fire the projectile, all while the ship was rolling 15 degrees in a heavy swell and someone was trying to drop a 500-pound bomb on his head. The result was a statistic that kept admirals in Washington awake at night. 2,400. That is the number of anti-aircraft shells the U.S. Navy had to fire in 1942 to bring down one single enemy aircraft. Think about the logistics of that number. To kill a squadron of 10 bombers, a ship would have to fire 24,000 heavy shells. That is more ammunition than most ships could even carry. The barrels of the guns would melt before they finished the job. Back on the deck, O'Malley fires again, and again. The sky is filled with black puffs. A box barrage. a curtain of steel. It doesn't matter. The Japanese pilot slips through the gaps in the time settings. He releases his payload. The bomb strikes the carrier Hornet. A geyser of fire and water erupts. Men scream, steel twists. O'Malley slams his fist against the hot steel of the gun mount. He is doing his job. The fire control radar is doing its job. But the shells are dumb. They are blind. They are flying right past the enemy, oblivious to the target just 50 feet away. As the smoke drifts over the water, darkening the Pacific sun, the reality sets in. The Axis powers have bet everything on speed. The Zero, the Stuka, the V weapons being dreamed up in Germany, they are all designed to move faster than a human can think, and certainly faster than a clockwork gear can tick. If the United States Navy cannot find a way to make a shell that knows when to explode, the war in the Pacific is already over. The fleet is nothing more than a collection of floating steel coffins, waiting to be sunk. While the Navy was learning the hard lessons of inaccuracy in the Pacific, a different kind of war was beginning in the leafy suburbs of Washington, D.C. It is August 1940. The location is the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. It sounds like a boring academic outpost for studying rocks and compasses. It was actually the headquarters of Section T. The air inside does not smell of ocean spray or cordite. It smells of stale tobacco smoke, chalk dust, and high-voltage ozone. Walking these halls is Dr. Merle Tuve. Erase your mental image of the frantic, scatterbrained scientist. Tuve is a general of physics. He is intense, abrasive, and driven by a singular, terrifying logic. While others worried about budgets, Tuve worried about time. He famously told his staff, "I don't want you to save money. I want you to save time. We are losing time, and we are losing lives." Tuve knew the math from Chapter 1. He knew the gunners were failing. He knew the only solution was a smart shell proximity fuse that carried its own radar set. But to build a radio in 1940, you needed vacuum tubes. If you are old enough to remember the back of a pre-war radio set, you know what a vacuum tube looks like. It is a fragile glass bulb, filled with delicate wire filaments, thinner than a human hair, suspended in a vacuum. If you drop one on the kitchen floor, it shatters. If you shake it too hard, the filaments snap and the radio goes dead. Tuve's assignment was to take that delicate glass bulb and put it inside a 5-inch artillery shell. Here is the physics problem that made the experts laugh in Tuve's face. When a fighter pilot pulls a hard turn, he experiences 9 Gs, 9 times the force of gravity. At that pressure, the blood drains from his brain, and he blacks out. If you drive a car into a brick wall at 45 miles per hour, your body experiences roughly 50 Gs. That is usually fatal. When a 5-inch naval gun is fired, the shell accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in the span of a barrel length. The force exerted on the object inside is not 9 Gs. It is not 50 Gs. It is 20,000 Gs. Let's put that number in perspective. At 20,000 Gs, a standard copper wire turns into a liquid. At 20,000 Gs, a solder joint shears off like it was cut by a guillotine. At 20,000 Gs, a vacuum tube doesn't just break. It is pulverized into dust before the shell even leaves the muzzle. The challenge facing Section T was not just difficult, it was absurd. As one engineer put it, the task was equivalent to screwing a light bulb into the nose of a freight train, ramming the train through a brick wall at 300 miles per hour, and expecting the light bulb to still be on when it comes out the other side. But Tuve didn't care about the absurdity. He cared about the deadline. He gathers his team. They are young, hungry, and terrified of failure. They begin buying every radio tube on the market. They act like children, dropping them off the roof. They shoot them out of air cannons. They encase them in wax. They suspend them in plastic. Day after day, The sound in the lab is the same. The thump of the test cannon. The tinkle of shattered glass. They tried potting the tubes in hard resin. They fire the test slug into a lead block to catch it. They pry open the casing, their hands trembling, hoping to see the glass intact. Dust. Just glass dust and twisted wire. The filaments are shearing off under the weight of their own existence. Under 20,000 Gs, the tiny wire filament weighs as much as a heavy iron chain. It snaps under its own weight. Fuze lights another cigarette. The smoke curls around a chalkboard covered in equations that all equal 0. The Navy is demanding a weapon. The British are begging for help against the Luftwaffe. And Section T has nothing but a pile of broken glass. They run a final test for the week with a new, ruggedized design from Western Electric. They load the propellant. They clear the range. Boom. They recover the shell. They hook it up to the diagnostics. Silence. The tube is dead. The circuit is broken. The smart shell is still just a dumb rock. Fuze looks at the failed unit, then at his team. The physics suggest it cannot be done. But the war won't wait for physics. They have to find a way to cheat gravity. Or the boys in the Pacific. It is August 12, 1942. The humid air of the Chesapeake Bay hangs heavy over the superstructure of the newly commissioned cruiser, the USS Cleveland. The ship is at general quarters, but this is not a battle. It is an audition. Standing on the bridge, observing the proceedings with eyes like flint, is Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. Beside him stands Dr. Vannevar Bush, the pipe-smoking architect of the American scientific war effort. The atmosphere is tight. The Navy has spent millions of dollars on a secret project that, so far, has produced nothing but broken glass and excuses. "Target inbound," the talker shouts. On the horizon, a drone appears. It is a radio-controlled target plane, buzzing toward the Cleveland like a lethargic mosquito. In a real battle, the sky would be black with flak. The gunners would be hammering out a box barrage, filling a cubic mile of air with steel, hoping the law of averages would grant them a hit. But today, the order is different. Load Mark 32. Fire when ready. The gunners on the aft 5-inch mount engage. They don't crank out a stream of fire. Boom. One shell. Boom. A second shell. Then, a sound that no sailor on that deck had ever heard before. It wasn't the dull, distant K-O-T of a mechanical time fuse exploding at the end of its timer. It was a sharp, violent crack snap, like a whip breaking the sound barrier, but amplified 1,000 times. The first shell exploded just above the drone. The second shell exploded just below it. There was no third shell. There didn't need to be. The drone didn't just crash. It ceased to exist as an aerodynamic object. The shrapnel from the proximity bursts shredded the wings, the engine, and the control surfaces in a millisecond. The target simply dissolved into a cloud of debris and splashed into the murky waters of the Chesapeake. On the bridge, there was a stunned silence. Admiral King, a man known for his icy demeanor and lack of praise, lowered his binoculars. He looked at Vannevar Bush. "Doctor," King said, "I think we have changed the war." Now let's pivot to the math, because the numbers witnessed that day were staggering. Remember Chapter 1? We established that the statistical average to kill a plane with mechanical fuses was 2,400 rounds. On that August afternoon, the USS Cleveland demonstrated a new average: 3 free shells per kill. The efficiency of the anti-aircraft battery had not just improved by 10% or 20%. It had improved by 80,000%. The light bulb in a cannon worked. The vacuum tubes held. The wet battery energized. The radio waves sensed the target, and the shell detonated at the precise moment of maximum lethality. It was a technological miracle that promised to sweep the Japanese Air Force from the skies. But then, the celebration stopped. A cold realization washed over the high command. This weapon was too good. If the United States began firing these shells over Europe, there was a statistical certainty that eventually one would fail to detonate. It would land in a German field, bury itself in the mud, and be recovered by Wehrmacht engineers. If German scientists opened that casing and found the vacuum tubes, they would understand immediately. They would reverse engineer it. And within 6 months, the Luftwaffe would be firing proximity fuses at American B-17 bombers. The result would be the annihilation of the Allied air forces. So, in the moment of their greatest triumph, the generals made a heartbreaking decision. General George Marshall issued the order. The project was classified POSIT AOZ, a level of secrecy higher than the atomic bomb project at the time. And then came the restriction. The variable time fuse is restricted to use over water only. Under no circumstances is it to be fired over land where a dud could be recovered by the enemy. The miracle shell was locked away in the magazines of the Navy. It would save the ships in the Pacific. But for the freezing American infantrymen about to face the German Wehrmacht in Europe, the magic shell was forbidden. They would have to fight the hardest battles of the war without it. It is January 5, 1943. The skies over the Solomon Islands. Below, the slate-gray waters of the Slat churn with the wakes of the U.S. Navy. Lieutenant Commander Sato, a representation of the veteran Japanese naval aviator, adjusts his goggles. He looks down at the American light cruiser USS Helena. He is not afraid. He has done this a dozen times since Pearl Harbor. He knows the rhythm of the American gunners. He knows their weakness. He knows that if he dives at 240 knots, then abruptly banks left and cuts his throttle, the American mechanical time fuses will fail. The math takes too long. By the time the American fuse setters crank their dials to where they think he is, he will be gone. The black puffs of flak will explode harmlessly in his wake, miles off target. Sato pushes the stick forward. The engine screams. The wind rushes over the canopy. He sees the muzzle flashes ripple along the deck of the Helena. He sneers. Too slow, he thinks. You are always too slow. He banks left, bracing for the usual turbulence of near misses. Crack! There is no warning. There is no distant puff of smoke. The air immediately in front of his propeller simply detonates. It sounds like a handful of gravel thrown into a box fan. The canopy shatters. The instrument panel disintegrates. Sato feels the plane lurch violently, not from the wind, but from the sudden loss of his right wingtip. He pulls back on the stick. Nothing happens. The cables are severed. Blood runs into his eyes. His confusion is greater than his pain. I was evasive, he thinks. I changed speed. I changed depth. They cannot calculate that fast. He is right. The gunners couldn't calculate that fast, but the shell could. Let's pause the camera as Sato's plane spirals toward the ocean and look at the invisible geometry that just killed him. This is the secret of the toroidal field. The VT fuse did not look forward like a camera. Instead, the tiny radio transmitter in the nose broadcast a continuous wave of radio energy. But it didn't broadcast it in a straight line. It projected the waves out to the side, perpendicular to the shell's path. Imagine a giant invisible donut traveling through the sky at 2,000 feet per second. The shell is the hole in the donut. The donut itself is a sensing field of radio waves. Here is the hidden stat that changed the Pacific War: 70 feet. That is the lethal radius of the sensor. With the old mechanical fuses, the shell had to occupy the exact same physical space as the airplane, a direct hit. or explode within a fraction of a second of passing it. With the VT fuse, the shell only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target. As soon as Sato's dive bomber entered that 70-foot donut, his metal fuselage reflected the radio waves back to the shell. The vacuum tubes inside the shell sensed the return signal. The circuit closed. The Thyratron switch fired. Boom! The shell didn't wait to hit him. It detonated at the point of closest approach. It turned the air into a shotgun blast of high-velocity steel shrapnel, shredding the delicate control surfaces of the aircraft. The math had shifted from precision sniping to area denial. The American gunners no longer needed to hit a bullet with a bullet. They just had to get close. Back in the cockpit, the water is rushing up to meet Sato. The roar of the wind is deafening. He hits the water. Darkness. On the bridge of the USS Helena, the captain lowers his binoculars. He has just watched a squadron of enemy bombers wiped out before they could release a single payload. The decks are covered in brass casings, but the ship is unscratched. The report of this engagement makes its way back to the Japanese High Command in Tokyo. They read the loss rates. They see that their best pilots are not returning. But here is the tragedy of their arrogance. They dismiss the report. Bad luck, the admirals say. Or perhaps the Americans have installed a new radar director for their guns. They cannot conceive that the shell itself is alive. They cannot imagine that the Americans have put a radio station inside a bullet. So they issue no new orders. They tell their pilots to fly the same profiles, use the same tactics. If you ask anyone who lived in London in June of 1944, they won't tell you about the sirens. They will tell you about the rhythm. It sounded like a Model T Ford trying to climb a steep hill. It sounded like a chainsaw idling in the sky. It was the sound of the V-1 flying bomb, the Doodlebug, Hitler's vengeance weapon. But the noise wasn't what terrified you. You could live with the noise. It was the silence that killed you. The V-1 was a crude cruise missile. It had a simple guidance system, a propeller on the nose that counted the revolutions. When the counter hit 0, meaning the bomb had reached London, the fuel line was cut. The engine would stop. The put would cease. And in that sudden, deafening quiet, you knew. You had exactly 10 seconds before 2,000 pounds of Amatol high explosive erased your city block. For the British anti-aircraft crews stationed in the gun belt south of London, the V-1 was a nightmare that defied logic. It wasn't a pilot you were fighting. It wasn't a terrified German boy named Hans who wanted to go home to his mother. It was a machine. It felt no fear. It felt no G-force. It didn't flinch when tracers zipped past it. It just flew straight, level, and fast. 400 miles per hour. That was the math problem. The V-1 flew at 2,500 feet, too low for the heavy anti-aircraft guns to track effectively, and too fast for the light guns to catch. The British gunners were exhausted. They were burning out barrels firing thousands of rounds of standard mechanical fused shells. They were filling the sky with steel, but the robots just flew right through it. The statistics were grim. In the first week of the V-1 attacks, the anti-aircraft batteries destroyed less than 17% of the targets. The rest sailed into London, killing civilians by the thousands. And here lies the great tragedy of June 1944. The solution to the problem was sitting in a warehouse less than 50 miles away. Thousands of crates marked top secret were stacked in U.S. Navy depots in England. Inside were the VT proximity fuses. They were the perfect weapon for the V-1. The donut of death we described in Chapter 4 didn't need a direct hit. It would sense the metallic skin of the flying bomb and swat it out of the sky like a fly. But the crates remained sealed. The order from General Marshall and the Joint Chiefs was absolute do not use over land. The paranoia was still in effect. The Allied command was terrified that a V-1 might be shot down, crash in a field, and leave a dud VT fuse intact. If a German spy recovered it, or if the Germans captured the area, the secret would be out. So while London burned, the miracle shells gathered dust. General Eisenhower was caught in a vice. On one side, the security of the future invasion of Germany. On the other side, the immediate slaughter of British civilians. Winston Churchill was not a man to be trifled with when his capital was under fire. He saw the reports. He knew the Americans had a magic bullet. The Prime Minister reached out to the Americans. The message was clear. We are drowning. Throw us the life preserver. The compromise was struck in a smoke-filled room. The ban on land use was technically upheld, but with a geographical loophole. The anti-aircraft guns would be moved. They would be stripped from the suburbs of London and redeployed to the very edge of the English coast, the white cliffs of Dover and the marshes of Kent. The order was specific. You may use the VT fuse, but you must fire out to sea. If the shell missed, it would splash into the English Channel, sinking to the bottom where the Germans could never find it. If it hit, the wreckage of the V-1 would fall into the water. It was a gamble. It required moving hundreds of guns and thousands of men in a matter of days. But as the sun set on the English Channel in mid-July, the crates were pried open. The gunners held the strange new shells with the plastic noses. They didn't know how they worked. They only knew they were told. By late August 1944, the coastline of southeastern England had transformed. It was no longer a vacation spot for weary Londoners. It was the diver strip. General Frederick Pyle, the commander of Britain's anti-aircraft command, had gambled everything on the American secret. He moved his guns away from the cities, lining them up along the white cliffs of Dover and the marshlands of Kent. The muzzles pointed east, out over the gray chop of the English Channel. The orders were strict. Engage the enemy over the water. If you miss, let the sea take the secret. On a blustery Tuesday morning, the radar operators picked up the swarm. A wave of V-1 buzz bombs was inbound, launched from the Pas-de-Calais in France. Sergeant Major Mac McAllister, a veteran of the Blitz, stood by his 3.7-inch heavy gun. Months ago, this moment would have induced panic. The crew would have been frantically spinning hand wheels, trying to match the 400 more speed of the robots, knowing that statistically they were wasting their time. But today, McAllister just watched. The gun was linked to the new American SCR-584 radar. The fuse setters were loading the shells with the plastic noses, the VT fuses. Put. The sound drifted over the cliffs. The robots appeared, black specks against the overcast sky. The guns opened fire. Crack, crack, crack. To McAllister's eyes, it looked like magic. There were no near misses. There were no clouds of wasted flak. As each shell approached a V-1, the invisible radio donut sensed the metal skin of the bomb. The sky over the channel turned into a graveyard of fireballs. One after another, the V-1s simply disintegrated. Their wings sheared off. Their warheads detonated prematurely, creating massive plumes of white water as the wreckage slammed into the sea. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Now, let's pivot to the math, because the numbers from August 1944 are some of the most lopsided in the history of warfare. Before the arrival of the VT fuse, when gunners relied on mechanical time fuses and optical tracking, the Royal Artillery destroyed roughly 24% of the V-1s launched at London. The majority slipped through to kill civilians. With the introduction of the VT fuse, combined with radar tracking, that number didn't just double, it skyrocketed. By the end of August, the kill rate hit 79%. But the statistic that truly broke the German spirit occurred in the final week of the bombardment. On one specific day, the Germans launched 101 V-1 flying bombs at the English coast. The Allied guns, equipped with the proximity fuse, shot down 97 of them. 97 out of 101. It was a defensive efficiency of nearly 96%. The weapon that Hitler promised would raze London to the ground was being swatted out of the sky with the casual ease of a man killing mosquitoes. The robot blitz was over. The V-1 had been defeated not by courage, but by a vacuum tube. McAllister watched the last burning wreck sink beneath the waves. The silence returned to the cliffs. He lit a cigarette, his hand steady. The terror was gone. But while the British coast celebrated, a different kind of terror was building 500 miles away. The narrative now shifts from the safety of the Dover cliffs to the freezing, snow-packed forests of the Belgian-German border, the Ardennes. It is December. The American infantry is dug in. They are cold, they are tired, and they are woefully unprepared. Hitler is not done. He has gathered his last great reserve of panzer tanks and SS infantry. He is planning a massive surprise winter offensive that will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The American artillery crews in the Ardennes have plenty of guns, they have plenty of ammunition, but they are missing one thing. The VT fuses are still sitting in crates in England. The ban is still in effect. Do not use overland. As the German tanks begin to rumble their engines in the mist, the American GIs are about to face the onslaught with one hand tied behind their backs. The weapon that could save them is forbidden, and for many of them, that decision will be fatal. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, along the border of Belgium and Germany. It is 5:30 in the morning. The temperature is hovering near zero. A thick, suffocating mist clings to the pine trees, reducing visibility to less than 20 yards. The GIs call it Hitler weather. For the past 3 years, the American way of war had relied on one thing above all else: air power. If the Germans moved, we bombed them. If they massed tanks, we strafed them. But on this morning, the United States Army Air Force is grounded. The fog has blinded the pilots, and in that blindness, the German war machine begins to move. Private First Class Jimmy Miller, an 18-year-old from Ohio, is shivering in a foxhole near the town of St. Vith. He is part of the 106th Infantry Division, a unit so green they haven't yet seen a real fight. They were sent here to the Ghost Front to acclimatize. It was supposed to be a quiet sector. Then, the ground begins to shake. It starts as a low rumble, felt in the teeth before it is heard in the ears. Then comes the squeal of unlubricated steel tracks. Then the roar of Maybach engines. Field Marshal Walter Model has achieved the impossible. He has secretly massed 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks directly in front of the weakest point in the Allied line. He is launching the last great gamble of the Third Reich, the Battle of the Bulge. Jimmy grabs the field phone. "Tanks! We have Tigers in the open. Requesting artillery support." The artillery behind the lines answers. The 105mm and 1 Yondrat Perfect-hour howitzers roar into action. They fire a time-on-target barrage intended to crush the German infantry advancing alongside the tanks. But when the shells land, something disastrous happens. Or rather, something doesn't happen. Let's pivot to the physics of winter warfare, because the geology of the Ardennes was fighting against the Americans just as hard as the Nazis were. The ground was a mixture of deep snow and soft, freezing mud. When a standard high-explosive shell with a point-detonating contact fuse hits concrete or hard dirt, it explodes on the surface, sending jagged steel shrapnel flying horizontally at supersonic speeds. That shrapnel cuts down infantry like a scythe. But when that same shell hits 4 feet of snow and soft mud, it penetrates. The shell buries itself deep into the muck before the fuse triggers. The explosion happens underground. The earth and snow absorb the blast. The lethal shrapnel is trapped in a crater of mud. The result is a muffled thump, followed by a geyser of dirty slush. From his foxhole, Jimmy watches in horror. The American artillery is landing right on top of the Germans, but the enemy soldiers just dive into the snow, wait for the thud, and then stand up. They are dusting themselves off. They are laughing. The mud trap has rendered the U.S. artillery impotent. The German infantry, emboldened by their survival, surge forward. The American line begins to crumble. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stares at the map. The situation is catastrophic. The Bulge is ripping open his front lines. The 106th is being encircled. The 101st Airborne is trapped at Bastogne. Reports flood in from the artillery commanders. Shells ineffective. Enemy infantry advancing through barrages. We need airbursts, but we can't set time fuses fast enough for moving targets. Eisenhower knows he has a trump card. He knows that in the supply depots in England and Antwerp, there are crates marked POSIT, the VT fuses, the ones that don't need to hit the ground, the ones that explode above the ground, raining death downward, regardless of snow or mud. But he also remembers the order, do not use over land. If he releases them and the Germans capture a dud, the secret of the vacuum tube fuse is out. The Japanese might get it. The Germans might use it against U.S. bombers. Eisenhower looks at the casualty reports. He looks at the weather forecast, fog for another week. He turns to his chief of staff. Release them, he orders. Release the fuses. Get them to the guns. Now. The gamble is made. The secret is burned to save the soldiers. But an order in Versailles is not ammunition in the breach. The fuses are hundreds of miles away. The cliffhanger is a race against gravity and ice. Convoys of Red Bull Express trucks are being loaded frantically in the rear. Drivers are practically throwing the crates into the back of deuce-and-a-halfs. They tear out of the depots, tires spinning on the black ice of the Belgian roads. They have to drive through the chaos of a retreating army to get to the guns. In his foxhole, Jimmy Miller is out of ammo. He hears the German voices getting closer. He looks back at the snowy road, praying for a truck, praying for a miracle. But the road is empty, and the Tigers are closing in. It is late December 1944. The location is Elsenborn Ridge, the critical northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge. This is the hinge. If the Germans can crack this ridge, they can roll up the American line and drive to the sea. Facing the Americas is the 12th SS Panzer Division and waves of Volksgrenadier infantry. These are not raw recruits. Many are veterans of the Eastern Front. They have survived the meat grinder of Russia. They know the rules of artillery survival. Rule number 1. When you hear the whistle of incoming mail, you dive. Rule number 2. Get below ground level. If a shell hits the mud, the blast goes up and out. If you are in a foxhole, even a shallow one, the shrapnel flies over your head. You shake off the dirt, you stand up, and you keep attacking. But on this gray, freezing afternoon, the rules changed. The trucks from the previous chapter had arrived. The American 105mm and 155mm howitzer batteries were now stacked high with the POSIT fuses. The German infantry began their assault. Thousands of gray-clad figures moving across the snow-covered fields, supported by King Tiger tanks. They were confident. They outnumbered the Americans. They knew the Americans couldn't see well enough to snipe them. Then, the sky fell down. Let's look at the hidden stat that turned Elsenborn Ridge into a graveyard. 20 feet. That was the optimal height of burst programmed into the VT fuse. The radio transceiver in the nose of the shell wasn't just looking for metal airplanes anymore. It was looking for the Earth. As the shell plummeted toward the battlefield, it sent out its radio waves. When the ground reflected the signal back at the precise intensity indicating a distance of 20 to 50 feet, the fuse fired. It didn't hit the mud. It didn't bury itself in the snow. It exploded instantly directly overhead. The physics of an airburst are devastatingly simple. When a shell detonates 20 feet in the air, the shrapnel doesn't fly up. It is driven down in a conical spray of supersonic steel. It turns the entire area beneath it into a kill zone. But at Elsenborn, there was a second, grimmer factor. The Ardennes is a dense forest. When the VT shells detonated at treetop level, they didn't just spray steel. They shattered the tops of the grand fir trees. Huge, jagged spears of timber, some as long as a man's arm, rained down alongside the hot metal. It was a double shrapnel effect. Let's shift our perspective to Sergeant Hans Weber, a platoon leader in the Volksgrenadiers. He hears the shriek of the American artillery. He screams, "Deckung! Cover!" He dives into a pre-dug foxhole. He curls into a ball, hands over his helmet, waiting for the ground to shake. But the ground doesn't shake. The air cracks. Weber expects safety. Instead, the bottom of his foxhole erupts in dust and blood. The shrapnel is coming straight down. The earth walls of his hole, which had protected him in Russia, are now useless. He is trapped in a bucket, and the Americans are pouring fire into it. The assault didn't just fail, it was erased. American forward observers watched through binoculars with a mix of awe and revulsion. One lieutenant radioed back, his voice trembling. "It was like a scythe, sir. They just dropped. The whole line." It didn't stop the attack, it evaporated it. The official reports from the battle state that the German infantry refused to advance. They told their officers that the Americans had a new death ray. They claimed the trees themselves were exploding. The German offensive at Elsenborn Ridge was broken. The Bulge was contained. The VT Fuze had successfully made the transition from sea to land, and in doing so, it had saved the U.S. Army from disaster. But while the snows of Europe turned red, the war was far from over. Half a world away, in the tropical heat of the Pacific, the United States Navy was preparing for the final push toward the Japanese home islands. The admirals thought they had solved the air threat. They thought the turkey shoot days were the new normal. They were wrong. The Japanese had analyzed the battles of 1944. They realized that conventional bombing was futile against the American defenses. So, they stopped trying to survive. They were preparing a new tactic, a tactic that defied the logic of warfare. They weren't sending machines like the German V-1s. They were sending men. Men who... It is April 16, 1945. The Philippine Sea, off the coast of Okinawa. The sun is high and cruel, baking the steel decks of the USS Laffey. The Laffey is a Sumner-class destroyer, a tin can sitting in the deadliest parking spot on Earth, Radar Picket Station, number 1. Her job is to sit 50 miles north of the fleet, run her radar, and scream a warning when the enemy comes. She is the sacrificial lamb, dangled on a hook to protect the aircraft carriers behind her. The sailors haven't slept in 3 days. Their eyes are rimmed with red grit. They are drinking coffee that tastes like battery acid just to keep their hands from shaking. Then the squawk box crackles. Raid reported, bearing 300, distance 10 miles, closing fast. The men run to their stations, but they don't run with the crisp energy of 1942. They move with the heavy, robotic motion of the doomed. They know what is coming. Operation Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemums. This was not air combat as the world understood it. In Europe, the Luftwaffe pilots were skilled predators. If you shot at them, they broke formation. They tried to survive. But the Japanese pilots approaching the Laffey have no landing gear. They have no parachutes. They have written their death poems. They are not trying to fight. They are trying to become missiles. Gunner's mate Smitty, strapped into a twin 40mm Bofors mount, watches the first plane dive. It's a Val dive bomber. Commence firing. The Laffey erupts. The 5-inch guns boom, hurling VT fuses into the path of the attackers. The 40mm and 20mm guns chatter like jackhammers. Boom. A VT fuse catches the first plane. The donut of death senses the engine block, detonates, and shears the wing off. The plane cartwheels into the ocean, exploding in a pillar of orange fire. But there is no time to cheer.
2 more. Starboard bow.
This is the tactical nightmare. The VT Fuze is a miracle, but it obeys the laws of physics. It takes time to load. It takes time to aim. The Japanese are sending more planes than the Americans have seconds. Let's look at the math of the swarm. On this single morning, the USS Laffey is attacked by 50 aircraft. She is subjected to 22 separate attacks in a span of 80 minutes. The guns are firing so fast that the cooling systems are failing. The barrels of the 40mm guns are glowing cherry red. The paint on the gun shields is blistering. Loaders are pouring buckets of seawater onto the breeches to keep the rounds from cooking off. Exploding inside the gun before the trigger is pulled. Smitty presses his pedal. A Judy dive bomber is coming straight at him. He sees the prop spinning. He sees the pilot's white scarf. The VT shells from the main battery are tearing holes in the sky, creating a wall of shrapnel. But this pilot doesn't flinch. He flies through the flak. Clang. The sound is sickening. It isn't the hollow thud of a bomb, it is the screech of aluminum tearing through steel. The plane slams into the Laffey's aft deck. The sensory overload is total. The world vanishes in a wash of burning aviation fuel. The smell is distinct, a sweet chemical stench that chokes the lungs. Burning aluminum, burning rubber, burning flesh. The ship shudders. The rudder is jammed. The fires are spreading. Commander Becton, the captain, shouts down from the bridge.
Do not abandon ship. I'll never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire.
And the guns do keep firing. The VT Fuzes are the only thing keeping them alive. They are snapping enemy planes out of the air at ranges that would be impossible with manual aim. The destroyers are knocking down 80–90% of the attackers. But 90% isn't enough when the enemy has infinite resolve. The Laffey is a floating wreck. She is on fire, listing, and surrounded by debris. The water around the ship is choked with oil and the wreckage of Japanese planes. Smitty wipes the soot from his goggles. He looks at the ready service locker. It's almost empty. The floor is knee-deep in brass casings. He looks up at the horizon. A dark smudge appears against the blue sky. It gets wider. It gets taller. It is another wave, the largest yet. 50, maybe 60 planes. They buzz like angry bees. The captain looks at his talker. The radio is dead. The radar is smashed. They are alone, burning, and out of ammo. They have survived the impossible for 80 minutes, but the next 80 seconds look like the end. The floating chrysanthemums are coming to finish the job. May 1945. The Battle of Okinawa is reaching its bloody crescendo. The floating chrysanthemums from the previous chapter are still coming. The Japanese High Command is pouring every remaining aircraft they possess into the furnace. Old biplanes, trainers, bombers, anything with an engine is being welded shut with a pilot inside, destined for a one-way trip. But the panic of the early days is gone. The terror aboard the destroyers has been replaced by a cold, rhythmic efficiency. If you stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri during these final days, you wouldn't see the frantic, spotty flak of 1942. You would see a wall of steel. The 5-inch guns are thumping in a steady, terrifying cadence. They are no longer firing wild box barrages, hoping to catch a plane by luck. They are firing with the precision of a surgeon. Boom, crack. Boom, crack. The sky ahead of the fleet is not filled with smoke, it is filled with sudden, violent flashes of orange light. Let's shift into the cockpit of Ensign Tanaka. He is flying a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy. He has broken through the screen of American fighter planes. He is fast. He is determined. Through his salt-smeared windshield, he sees the gray slab of an American cruiser. He is 1,000 yards out. The flak is heavy, but he dives. He is 500 yards out. He screams the name of the Emperor. He grips the stick. He is going to make it. He is 300 yards out. Then the universe ends. There is no impact. No tracer round punches through his canopy. Instead, a 5-inch shell passes 30 feet off his left wing. In 1942, that would have been a miss. The American gunners would have cursed. But this is 1945. The tiny vacuum tubes inside the shell glass bulbs, no bigger than a peanut, encased in wax, sense the radio reflection of Tanaka's plane. The circuit closes. The wet battery dumps its charge. Snap. The shell detonates instantly. It doesn't poke a hole in Tanaka's plane. It swats it from the air like a giant hand. The blast wave crushes the cockpit. The shrapnel shreds the engine block. The divine wind is extinguished by a radio wave. Tanaka's plane disintegrates into a cloud of confetti and falling aluminum, splashing harmlessly into the sea 200 yards from the ship. Now let's pivot to the math, because the statistics of Okinawa tell the story of the end of the war. Remember Chapter 1? In the panic of the early war, it took 2,400 shells to bring down a single airplane. It was a war of waste. By May 1945, ships equipped with the Mark 53 Director and the VT Fuze were recording kill ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. Less than 100 shells per plane. Some destroyers, like the USS Hadley, reported engaging swarms of kamikazes and shooting them down with single-digit ammunition expenditure. 3 shots, 1 kill. 2 shots, 1 kill. The efficiency of the American defense had increased by a factor of 25. It is a stark, almost melancholy contrast to reflect upon. On one side, you had the Empire of Japan. They were throwing their most precious resource, their youth, their spiritual heritage, the Bushido code of the samurai, into the fight. They were relying on willpower, blood, and sacrifice. On the other side, the Americans were fighting back with mass production. The vacuum tubes inside those shells weren't forged by warriors. They were assembled by women in factories in Sylvania, Ohio, and Newton, Massachusetts. They were designed by physicists who smoked pipes and used slide rules. Japan threw its soul at the fleet. America threw a circuit board. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a battle anymore. It was an industrial execution. As the sun set over the smoking remnants of the Japanese air fleet, the ocean was quiet. The kamikaze threat had been broken. Not by courage, though the sailors had plenty of that, but by American ingenuity. The air war was effectively over. The Japanese Navy was at the bottom of the Pacific. But as the gunners cleared the hot brass casings from the decks, the scientists back in Washington were already looking past Okinawa. They were calculating the future. They realized that the miracle shell had done more than just save ships. It had proven that electronics could be ruggedized, miniaturized, and weaponized. The VT Fuze was about to step aside for its bigger, louder brother, the atomic bomb. But the smart shell had quietly changed the DNA of warfare forever. The age of dumb iron was over. The age of the smart weapon had begun. When we think of the arsenal of democracy, we usually picture the deafening roar of a Detroit tank factory or the sparks flying from a welder's torch in a shipyard. We picture Rosie the Riveter, muscles flexed, wrestling steel plates. But the weapon that saved the Navy wasn't built with a sledgehammer. It was built with tweezers. It is 1944. Step onto the floor of the Sylvania plant in Emporium, Pennsylvania, or the Crosley Radio Corporation in Cincinnati. The air is still. The ventilation hums quietly. The smell isn't diesel or grease. It is the sharp, piney scent of hot rosin solder and melting wax. Row after row of women sit hunched over workbenches, staring through illuminated magnifying glasses. They are the unsung army of the VT Fuze. Let's meet Evelyn. She is 24 years old. Before the war, she was a seamstress, or perhaps she worked in a watch factory. The recruiters sought her out specifically. They didn't want muscle. They wanted dexterity. They needed hands steady enough to solder a wire thinner than a human hair to a metal pin the size of a grain of rice. Evelyn doesn't know what she is making. The foremen tell the girls they are building parts for a new type of hearing aid or experimental radio sets. The secrecy is absolute. The FBI is watching. But Evelyn knows the rules. They are brutal. If she drops a vacuum tube on the linoleum floor, she is not allowed to pick it up. She is not allowed to test it. She must sweep it into the trash. If she drops a tray of them, she is fired. Immediately. The logic was ruthless but necessary. A microfracture in the glass, invisible to the naked eye, might pass a factory test. But under the 20,000 G-force of a naval gun, that glass would shatter. And if the glass shattered, the shell would be a dud. And if the shell was a dud, a kamikaze would hit a U.S. destroyer. Evelyn held the lives of 10,000 sailors in her fingertips, and she didn't even know it. Now let's pivot to the math, because the scale of this secret operation is mind-boggling. We all know about the Manhattan Project. We know about the B-29 bomber. But the VT Fuze was the third largest research and development program of the war, costing over $1 billion in 1940s currency. By 1945, the American industrial machine wasn't just building a few prototypes. 40,000. That is the number of VT fuses being produced every single day. To get those numbers, the industry had to perform a miracle of quality control. To find vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive being shot out of a cannon, the factories had to embrace failure. During the war, American factories produced over 300 million sub-miniature vacuum tubes. They rejected 98% of them. Only the top 2%, the absolute strongest, the most perfectly formed, made it into the nose of a Mark 53 shell. The rest were discarded. It was an industrial extravagance that only America could afford. We threw away hundreds of millions of units just to ensure that the one unit in the barrel would work when it mattered. The contrast between the creation and the use of these devices is the defining image of the war. In Ohio, Evelyn gently solders a filament. The room is quiet. She wipes sweat from her brow, careful not to shake. She seals the unit in potting wax to protect it. 6 months later, in the Philippine Sea, that same unit is loaded into a breech. Boom. The wax melts. The battery energizes. The filament, the one Evelyn soldered, spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute. It screams toward a Japanese zero. It sends out the signal. It detonates. Evelyn goes home to her rationed dinner, rubbing her tired eyes. She has no idea that the radio part she finished at 2 p.m. just saved the USS Enterprise. As the summer of 1945 drags on, the output reaches its peak. The conveyor belts are moving faster than ever. The crates are piling up. And then, it stops. August 14, 1945. VJ Day. The whistles blow. The war is over. The soldiers are coming home. The contracts are canceled. The women like Evelyn pack up their tweezers and go back to being housewives, mothers, and grandmothers. They never speak of the secret work. But the world they are stepping back into has changed fundamentally. If you stand on the deck of a cruise ship off the coast of Okinawa, or look out from the cliffs of Dover, you hear only the wind and the waves. The screaming engines are gone. The thumping of the 5-inch guns has faded into history. But let's go back to Iowa one last time. Picture Red O'Malley. Remember him? The terrified 20-year-old gunner's mate from Chapter 1, sweating in his dungarees, cursing the impossible geometry of hitting a diving zero. Picture him 50 years later. He is sitting on his back porch. The sun is setting over the cornfields. He is watching his grandchildren play in the yard. He is old, gray, and happy. He doesn't talk much about the war, but he is there, and his children are there, and his grandchildren are there. They exist because of a glass tube the size of a peanut. If the VT fuse had failed, if Merle Tuve had given up, if Evelyn in the factory had dropped that tray, if the admirals had kept the crates sealed, Red O'Malley would have died in 1943. The USS Laffey would have sunk. The 101st Airborne would have been overrun in the Bulge. London would have been leveled. The history books often give the credit for ending the war to the atomic bomb, and rightly so. The bomb provided the final, deafening full stop to the conflict. But the atomic bomb didn't save the fleet at Okinawa. It didn't stop the panzers at Elsenborn Ridge. It didn't swat the V-1s from the skies of Kent. The atomic bomb ended the war, but the proximity fuse won it. General George S. Patton, a man who believed in blood, guts, and steel rather than science, admitted as much. In a letter to the War Department, he wrote the definitive epitaph for the device. "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies of this war are gone, the funny fuse will be written up as the most important invention." Patton understood what the Japanese and Germans never grasped. The Axis powers fought with what they called the triumph of the will. They believed that the warrior spirit, Bushido, the blitzkrieg, the suicidal fanaticism of the kamikaze could overcome any obstacle. They bet on human courage. The United States bet on industrial precision. We didn't try to out-fanaticize them. We out-engineered them. We took the warrior spirit and crushed it with a circuit board. We proved that no amount of bravery can survive a shell that explodes with mathematical certainty. It was the victory of the assembly line over the samurai. So, the next time you look at a smartphone or a GPS system or any piece of modern microelectronics, remember where it started. It didn't start in Silicon Valley. It started in a secret lab in Maryland, born from the desperate need to stop a diving plane. And if you ever find yourself looking out over the deep waters of the Pacific, remember what lies beneath. Down in the crushing dark, rusting on the ocean floor, lie the scattered remains of the Imperial Japanese Air Force. They are silent now.